This is Permissionless Liberty.
Welcome to Permissionless Liberty. I'm Dan Sanchez, joined as always with Adam Knott, by Adam Knott. And today we have a third person on the panel. We have Jake Klein, who is our producer and is also a libertarian intellectual in his own right. I met Jake when he did the Hazlitt Fellowship at the Foundation for Economic Education, where I'm broadcasting from and where I work. And and so Jake has a very strong ideas about liberty and especially in certain areas that he kind of focuses on. And so, Jake, welcome to Permissionless Liberty.
Thanks for having me. It's as you were saying, I've also produced the show, so it's been fun getting to listen into you guys every week, and it's cool to get to talk to you on this side too. So thanks for asking me to do this.
Welcome, Jake.
So what did you want to talk about first, Jake?
Yeah, did you have anything prepared, or do you want us to?
Oh, me! I didn't come with anything prepared. I came prepared to answer questions. So
okay. Well, first of all,
anything you guys want.
First of all, what kind of libertarian would you call yourself? And maybe like there's no label that can fit, but there are different camps among libertarians. There are left libertarians and right libertarians and populists and globalists and Austro-libertarians and objectivists. So what are your main influences and tendencies?
Yeah, so I would say the thing that brought me into the movement was an anti-war perspective. I was, when I was growing up, when I was a teenager, I grew up in a pretty traditional Democrat household, and it was the time of the Iraq War. So that was a real top political issue on my mind. And if you opposed the war at that time, it seemed to me, now I know there were some anti-war figures on the right, back then, but it seemed to me that, that meant you were on the left, that meant you were a Democrat. And then I discovered Ron Paul when Ron Paul ran for president in 2008. And for the first time, I saw somebody who was a Republican that agreed with me on this issue. And so from there, I started to learn from, I think, kind of a really wide swath of libertarian sources. I was reading materials from the Foundation for Economic Education, from organizations like the Institute for Humane Studies, Cato, the Mises Institute, the Ayn Rand Institute. Not that they're technically objectivist, but kind of just this overall perspective. I was reading people like Mises and Hayek, Rothbard, Ayn Rand, people like Michael Huemer and Brian Kaplan, and I was just got like so obsessed. I think that I have just kind of a very analytical mind, and so reading this very straightforward, very direct philosophy was very appealing to me. But I would say, the anti-war philosophy brought me in. And then a lot of the ethical and philosophy of law further deepened things. But the thing that really, really obsessed me was the Austrian economics perspective, where, when I was a teenager, I remember saying things like, I literally thought if people didn't support Medicare for all or any kind of socialized healthcare, it meant that they hated the poor. And why don't we just print money to pay for these things? The only reason we don't do this is because there's, people that want to be like better than others. That's what I thought. And obviously that's moronic. So starting to study economics, but I think if I'd started to study economics in a way that, I would later, when I would take econ classes in college, a lot of big models and macro and math and things like this. I don't think it quite would have appealed to that logical, analytical part of my mind. What really, really grabbed me in the same way that the philosophy did, but I think so much deeper, was the Mises Rothbard view on how to do economics, starting from the action axiom and developing the entire science of economics out of that. And it's just, I saw all the building blocks. I saw logic that to me largely looks impeccable. I mean, there's definitely things in the Rothbardian perspective, and I'm sure with Mises too, that I disagree with on economics. I think Rothbard gets fractional reserve banking wrong, among other things. But so it's not that they never ever deduced wrong, but certainly on all the big picture, on all the building blocks, I think that is the correct perspective, the correct way to do economics. Not necessarily the only way to do economics, maybe, but the main, best way to get to a proper economic theory. And that just changed my entire worldview. Particularly, I would say Mises's economic calculation in the socialist commonwealth. That sort of understanding about how you can't have an economy without prices. I mean, I think I really need to write this article at some point, but I think prices are the most fascinating, magical thing in the world that people just take for granted. They just see a number and don't think about everything that is required to make that number come to be. But then not just to come to be, then the coordinating function of that number for everything. And Mises didn't do this, but Rothbard did this, is I think the logical end game of that argument of the knowledge problem in economics is, or the calculation problem in economics really, is it's anarchism, because it's Rothbardian anarchism, because you can't, if you can't put a price on something, you can't rationally allocate it. And so we need to put a price on everything. And that means you can't have things provided by the government, or else it's not being rationally allocated. So I would say that, that's kind of the biggest, that Austro-libertarian tradition, but it's not exclusively that. I think I've gained things from most of the libertarian perspectives. I think I'm definitely, being in a more Rothbardian branch. I define myself as a right libertarian, although think that um, I think that one of the great things about libertarianism that I think we should be using to market it more is that you can be a more socially left-wing person and be a libertarian. You can be a more socially right-wing person and be a libertarian. And I see libertarians all the time just getting into these culture war battles. And to me, I'm an atheist. I'm very inspired by Ayn Rand in terms of metaphysics and her views on religion. But to me, libertarianism means I'm fighting for the most religiously conservative Christian to be able to form their Christian commune that would exclude people like me, right? Because that's what it is. It's about mutual respect for people of different lifestyles. And the trade that I hope we should offer each other, and that I think libertarianism proposes that we offer each other, is that, okay, you go your way and do that, and other people respect my way, or some third person's way, to go our ways and do what we want in our communities, or as isolated individuals if we want to live that way. So
Jake, let me just jump in real quick. I'd be interested to know 2 or 3 books that stand out for you, because you sounds like you've read quite a bit broadly in the libertarian literature, but just maybe 1, 2, or 3 books that stand out in your mind, because that you have to have on your bookshelf, or that you have the first one you're going to give your child when they're 18 or whatever. What are those books?
Well, give a child when they're 18 or younger is definitely Atlas Shrugged. I think that's the most important world-changing, book that there is. That book was really influential in terms of breaking me out of a really deep depression when I was in college, and that really deeply changed the way that I view the world. And I think many people have that story about Atlas Shrugged, and it does it in only a way that fiction can do. So I think that's really important. Other books, I would say Man, Economy, and State with Power and Market by Rothbard, because that really does that building economics from scratch thing, cleaner than anything else. And then building it, all the way through to anarchism. And then I would say also very influential on me, although there's certain major problems with it. So I don't recommend it without reservation, is Ethics of Liberty by Rothbard. But honestly, I would never give any standard to anybody who's asking, or to any person at any point in life, the same book recommendations necessarily. It's about where do they have questions, and where can they be educated most valuably. And often that's really in shorter things. Like I mentioned economic calculation in the Socialist Commonwealth before. Whenever there's somebody that doesn't know much about economics, or doesn't know much about the Austrian perspective on economics, that's like a 70 page, very, very short, mini book or essay. That's what I end up recommending to people most often, I think.
Yeah, but Atlas Shrugged was very influential for kind of life-changing, or I remember when I was in my 20s, I read The Fountainhead was the book that did it for me, that set my life on a direction and gave me a foundation to start to build off of. So it was very important.
Yeah, and I just watched the movie of The Fountainhead last night, because my wife had never seen it. So Ayn Rand wrote the screenplay for that, and it's obviously not as good as reading the book, but really something that it's so hard to get people to read a book these days, especially a novel that long. So if people can even just watch the movie, that's great.
Interesting.
So as you know, we talk on this podcast a lot about what Leonard Read calls the methodology of freedom, like how to achieve freedom. And so I was wondering, what are your thoughts about that?
Unfortunately, I'm not very optimistic right now. I think we're in a bad time. Something that has really struck me is that the conversation that we have as a society evolves over time and based on situations. And so I think Leonard Read's idea of the remnant is really important. The idea that, we're not necessarily going to convince everybody right now, but it's important to really, really educate at least a small share of deep believers, so that, they're there when people are ready to hear the message. Because you can look at places like Argentina right now, where they just got into a certain situation where the socialism went too far, the government debt, went too far, the inflation went too far, and the economy was falling apart. And people were ready for some other answer in that moment, something radically different. And there was Malay, there to give that to them. So I don't think America is in that place now, or is close to that place, but that could happen one day, and hopefully, we will be here making sense when people need us to make sense. The most optimistic I can get about the United States at this time, and I think this is a long shot, is that the war in Iran, which is a disaster already and is likely to only become more of a disaster, will lead to a reaction of people who see that disaster, and will maybe take some influence away from the people that got this wrong. And that, I think it's more likely, unfortunately, that that's just going to create another opening for the socialist left. And, this country is probably going towards, basically wherever Mamdani is taking New York City. But it's possible that, libertarianism done the right way could maybe take over the right in response to this war, if things happen the right ways. And then if a Mamdani style socialist takes over the country, then a libertarian Republican Party might become the opposition party, and then maybe eventually comes to power that way. So however it's going to happen, it's going to be a many years or probably decades long process until situations unfold in a way that make people receptive to the message that we have to offer. And I think right now, I just see things getting worse. I of course have my thoughts on marketing strategy. I mentioned before, like really making it a focus on, telling other people, I want to help you live your life better in the way that you see fit, even though I totally disagree with it, right? And focusing more on, what it can do for other people who are not you, rather than, we're just kind of, arguing why everybody else is bad, and trying to build up our own ability to gain our own freedom, which is of course ultimately what we're really trying to do. But I don't know that it's as successful a marketing pitch to other people. But I'm very conflicted about this, like in a lot of ways. I don't know that everybody can be a libertarian. I don't think everybody can be a libertarian. I think that we evolved for a tribal society, that we have now in so many ways in life evolved away from the habitat that we were adapted for. And you know you can look at primate behavior and how they have struggles for control over each other. And we are better than them. We are not as violent species like chimps, and we govern very differently. But I do worry, and the black pilled, I see very little hope. Part of myself, of just looking at thousands of years of human civilization, and tribal warfare even before that. That, like, this is just what we are. And I'm not sure. I'm not sure if we'll ever get out of it or not, but I hope we will.
Well, it's a good insight that your general insight that people aren't ready to receive a new idea politically, for sure. They're locked in. In the United States, we're locked into the two sides, and there's really no appetite for any kind of different, for an alternative. I agree with that. And I also agree with you that a sentiment that I really like what you did. Hopefully I heard it right, but as I see it, I want everybody who has a political ideal to be able to achieve it with like-minded people. So, but I don't want to have to be included. I don't want to be forced to be included. So that's how I think I keep my humanity, because I really truly don't want to force a communist or a, let's say, what would be on the right side of, I don't know what you want to call somebody on the right, but let's say just a Christian, a nationalist, let's say. I don't want to harm their ideals. I just want to be, I have my ideals, and I want to be able to go with like-minded people, libertarians, and form our own political union. So it's not really anti. I'm not really anti. It's really just, it's trying to get free. It's trying to, get the freedom to choose, as Mises would say, the freedom to choose. But I heard that I thought I heard a little bit of that in your reply.
Yeah, I think so. And I think, the challenge there is what you've spoken about so many times on this show, and that the show is named after, which is the idea of permissionless liberty, and the idea that the powers that be do not want to give that permission, right? So how do we break away when they don't want to do that? And I've seen a couple of little experiments that I hesitate to say I'm optimistic about, but that I think are the best that we have available right now at this point in time. Where, my wife and I went up to New Hampshire, where they're doing the Free State Project, and got to talk to some of the people there, and hear about what they're doing. And that seems like a very impressive effort at reducing state level laws and regulations. I understand they have over 100 people that identify as anarchists and voluntarists in their state house, which is like, extraordinary. And, then that's coupled with, more moderate libertarians and Republicans, that will vote with them. And so it sounds like, really accomplished a lot in changing policy up there. But how meaningful is that when so much of the power has moved to the federal government? I think they're trying to do some attempts at nullification up there, but once that really reaches a certain level, that sounds like that'll start like a little mini civil war. And I think the federal government is very, likely to win that if it ever gets taken there. And they'll probably rightfully be too scared to take it there anyway, because there's no point fighting a losing war like that. And you can see, you talked about the network state a couple episodes ago. That's an interesting idea. Maybe that will succeed. Something I'm really interested in a lot right now that's kind of adjacent to what you're talking to is digital privacy and online security, and all the ways in which the state is able to, or will soon be able to, mass collect all of our data and analyze that data and use that, how China is using it right now, and will only presumably continue to use it more, to really have a, irremovable grip on power and the ability to do almost anything with that power, to watch you at all times. And so I'm really taking a lot of steps right now to try to, um, um, anything that I can run myself, that I don't have to be reliant on some service that is probably feeding all their data into the NSA, like we saw from Ed Snowden's revelations. Or that tie my identity to things that they don't really need to be tied to. I think cryptocurrency is an important part of this, although I know it's really going to be hard to get to the level of freedom where that could actually replace state currencies, because they can just prevent stores from accepting it, and they can tax it every time you make a transaction in it, like they do right now.
Mhm.
And so it makes it unviable as an actual currency that can replace the Federal Reserve currency. But I think those kind of efforts, really trying to do as much as we can there to
Mhm.
try to hold on to the individual rights and privacy and self-ownership that we have in the digital space right now, is very important.
Mhm.
Because once that gets lost to the state, I mean, it really kind of, any hope is gone.
Right.
So very important we hold on to that right now and do as much as we can with that right now, and try to grow it as much as we can. I mean, maybe, I hope I'm wrong about cryptocurrency, and I hope that can be the biggest destruction to the power of the state, is to take away their power of currency, and then maybe it all falls from there, and maybe we do start building network states and things like this. I hope so, but it does seem like a long shot.
Well, one thing that I remember is that sometimes in the darkest time is when some of the most beautiful things are created. Don't forget that Ayn Rand, when she was writing, it wasn't that far removed from the New Deal, and she was writing in the middle of New York City, which I'm assuming was probably still the socialist capital of the world even back then. So, and she had just escaped from communist Russia, or immigrated or whatever. So, and I think Reagan used to say too, we think that there were all these pristine times, that there were all these calm times in the past. And he said once a few times that um, he contradicted that. He said, this is how it actually happens. There's always an emergency or a tumultuous times that actually, and he was trying to say that's kind of normal. So we have to just accept that. And now, so then it's up to us in the middle of that to not lose faith, to not lose hope, and create in the middle of that, So I agree with your assessment that things are very pessimistic. I agree 100%. But we don't know what's hidden from our view, what's developing, and what's kind of over the horizon. And if we're all working towards something, that keeps our spirits up until something can kind of emerge or something can kind of shift. So I think it makes sense to try to keep your fire burning and your passion burning and keep working, because when that thing does shift, you want to be kind of have put in some work and some foundational work so that you're ready to roll, as opposed to just saying "woe is me" for 2 decades and then something shifts and you're not ready to grasp. Uh, when oh shoot, this happened and I thought this was never going to happen, so I didn't get ready. That would be shame on you that you didn't prepare because you thought, oh well, this is never going to happen. So
I agree completely, and
right.
that's that's why I said I think the remnant philosophy is very important, and that social dynamics can change, like they did in Argentina, and there can be a time when this message is a winning message. And that's also why I think, it's so important to protect as much of our rights as we can now, so that when and if the time comes when the world or the country or some small community is ready for this message, that there's still, just enough freedom cracked open left that they can leverage it.
Yeah, I mean, we have the libertarians. We are the only people who are trying to figure out a theory and a politics of freedom. And what really disappointed me and harmed me personally in the last 4 years was that amazing amount of control that was coming out of the federal government. We've talked about the COVID lockdowns and really the attack on free speech, and with DEI and all that. And what's been really disappointing about our to bring up a topic, so a current topic with the foreign policy, is just the just full out use of control, of just force. So of course, by culture, each of us might say we kind of side on one side or the other, but you can't deny intellectually that we're bankrupt politically. We don't have any new ideas. The libertarians are the only ones who are trying to provide that. And people do notice. For example, when I went through, I'll never forget, you guys may know who Brett Weinstein is, right? And, I understand him and his wife to be lifelong leftists, from the Pacific Northwest. I could be wrong. But when we went through all the COVID lockdowns and stuff, he kind of glimpsed at what the libertarians, he saw the value of what we were trying to do. And in one of his posts on X, he said something like, I nominate the libertarians to be on to come to the table because they bring a lot to the table. So people do notice, so that's just one example, of course. I wish there were more people who said that, but it shows how somebody kind of woke up to, yeah, we need a different philosophy, a different approach. And we're the only ones who are, in our own ways, trying to provide that and keep that flame alive, because everybody else is just proposing further control, whether it's domestic or international. And it's disappointing that, because I thought America's supposed to be selling freedom. We're not supposed to be selling control or destruction or force. That we're supposed to be selling the flame of freedom, and it's been lost. We just we don't
It's
sell
very
freedom.
it's very clear to me, unfortunately, that what we present ourselves as on the international stage or domestically is not how we actually act on the international stage. We are um, we are we are the imperialists. We are the ones, and Trump has made this more clear than ever. We don't like what Venezuela is doing. Well, put a corrupt crony in place who will just sell us cheap oil. And, I think what we're trying and failing to do in Iran right now is similar. And meanwhile, you look at countries like China that we call these horrible international threats. And, I hate, much of what China is doing domestically. I went there last year, and in some ways, I was quite impressed. There's a couple areas in which they're more libertarian than us. One is IP law, which is you can get knockoffs of anything, often quite high quality. And I think that's nice actually. But actually the ease of starting a business there is much easier. Tax rates are comparable or slightly less, than they are in the United States. But there's cameras everywhere, and they're spying on you all the time. And if you express, people are very afraid to talk about politics there, and rightfully so, because they'll get in a lot of trouble. And so you can't challenge anything, about the political apparatus and what they want to do at all. And even if, luckily, much of it is not as restrictive as you might think, a lot of it is. And, any inability to, challenge that or to have free speech is horrific. So, but on the international stage, um, they're not, they might invade Taiwan, one country that they have a very specific grievance with, dating back a couple decades when it was once a unified territory. I would hate to see Taiwan be taken from China or be taken by China. But other than that, they're not going around, toppling regimes if they won't sell oil at the price that they want, and doing all the kinds of things that we do internationally. So we are kind of this, we are an empire, and we're not a benevolent empire. And hopefully, maybe in the future, we can go to a more multipolar world. Um, I always say, and I think the libertarian position is that we should be Switzerland. Switzerland has a great foreign policy. They're in a very defensible location. They're on the top of a mountain, and they just don't get involved in other people's affairs, and they try to maintain as much liberty for themselves as they can. And because of that, they're very wealthy and happy. And here in the United States, we have two oceans on both sides of us. And anytime I talk to somebody that seems to support a more aggressive foreign policy, I think there can be a couple, maybe two reasons why they do it. One is, well, if we don't do it, somebody else will do it. It'll be Russia or China. Not really seeing a lot of evidence that that's actually the case, but that's what they argue. And we offer more freedom to people than they do. So, we need to be the hegemon. That's reason one. The other reason is, well, we are an empire. Maybe we didn't ask to become one, but we just did. And, because of that, now a lot of our well-being domestically is wrapped up in protecting certain trade routes or getting good rates on certain products from certain countries or things like this. And I'd like to see some math on that, because it's really hard for me to imagine, with the amount that we spend on our military budget every year, and how expensive these wars are, that we're actually making more money than we're spending. We just spent over $10 billion in Iran in the last 2 weeks. When did the war start? Maybe about 2 weeks. This episode is going to come out a little later than we recorded it, so it certainly won't be right by the time we recorded it. But this is worth it to us. It's hard for me to imagine.
I guess here's so now that what you're expressing, I since we're having a discussion, and maybe mixing it up a little, because I've been thinking about this one issue quite a bit in the last few weeks, and you kind of just are kind of giving me an opportunity to express it. But we as citizens, of course, can critique what our welfare state is doing. So we're basically coerced welfare state citizens. We don't have, there's no opt out. So of course, all of us as citizens theoretically are supposed to have some sort of influence on what's happening with our government's conduct. And so, of course, we can criticize it. But the fundamental problem we have is if our relationship to our government stays the same, then we kind of just become critics of the existing system. And so what I came to believe, which is what I believe today, is that there's two ways I can potentially influence my government's conduct. And one is what I think in the spirit of what you were saying is criticize the conduct and try to influence it and say, listen, United States government, you want to do X, but I want you to do Y. But what I would advocate, because when you do that, you have to exert energy under that. So then you obviously de-emphasize something else. My goal is, if I am successful in altering the relationship between myself and my government, I trust that will influence my government's conduct in a positive way. So, and to me, those two things aren't identical. To me, they're mutually exclusive. That's probably a debate that, I'm sure someone would challenge me on. But to me, so therefore, I find it tragic what's happening, but I don't find it something that I'm interested in trying to influence, because I think that's much more important for myself. If I'm going to pour energy into it, I trust that if I can somehow alter the relationship between myself and my government, then I won't be the only one. Obviously, if I were successful, then there have to be other people. So that would start a movement. And now my government's conduct would have to take that into consideration in the calculus when it goes to do something. Now, somebody could say, well, Adam, you're crazy. That's never going to happen. Yeah, libertarianism isn't happening either. So we're all equal when it comes to whether our fantasies are happening or not.
But what would be the change in your relationship to government that would, prevent, it doesn't have to be wars, but just like wars, for example?
Well, yeah, I wouldn't argue that I could prevent it. I would argue that if the change would be if somehow I could gain, as Dan would phrase it, rights, not the whole country, just me and you and whoever wants them. If there was a group that could gain some sort of, like the network state, gain an autonomy, that would almost assuredly affect the state's ability to have unlimited resources, because the biological implication, if there's some autonomy, then that's just something that's not then controlled. Right now, I'm firmly controlled. In other words, because I don't want to go to jail, I'm fully have to abide by all the laws, some tax laws, regulations, the whole thing. If I had autonomy, I could act not according to the laws of my government, but still be free. But I don't have that, but that's what I would like to have. And as you know, I don't want to go far afield in a whole theory, but I just wanted to bring it back to, I have the option as a citizen of this country to say, okay, government, I'm a welfare state citizen, and here's what I want you to do, and I don't like what you're doing. And that could be effective or non-effective. But there's also a second way, which is to directly try to alter the relationship between yourself and your government, and in a sense, therefore impact the government's conduct in that indirect way. So, and I just heard you're giving the former, and I've given up, in a sense, the critique. I see everything you're saying. I see what's happening in Iran. I see what's happening in Venezuela. Let's go take Greenland, et cetera, et cetera. And I guess if you said, well, Adam, you're king of the welfare state, yeah, maybe I would do it differently. But to me, then if I'm going to do that, then I'm going to learn how to run a welfare state, which I'm not interested in. And I'm also really not interested in directing the proper conduct of a welfare state. It's like, to me, then I'm distracted, because what I was trying to get was liberty. And instead, what I got was the ability to influence welfare state conduct, which to me it's not even something I want to do, because I don't even like the premise of what it is. It says, we have these 350 million people. They're all beholden to us. They all have to contribute to our efforts. now, and they're like, so what should we do? Get in the room and what should we do? And then I'm in here in Nevada, say, oh, do this. Now that you have 350 million people captive and you have all their assets, do this, do that. No, do that. Oh, no, do that. It's like, well, no, I'm not going. I don't want to participate in that. I mean, it's not. I guess you could say that's too idealistic. I guess that would be the critique. But I think until we have a concrete alternative, everything we have is imaginary or idealistic because we don't have a reality of our own independent existence. We only have the existence that we have. But I still think even within that, we have an alternative approach that we could do. And I'm in the minority. I don't think people agree with me on that.
Well, I think I mostly agree with what you're saying, which is, if I'm understanding it right, and correct me if I'm wrong, is that, the most important thing to do is just to try to withdraw from the system to the best that you can, because then at least you cannot be complicit in it, right? Like if they're not able to take your tax dollars or anything else to, fund, their whatever bad things they want to do, welfare state or war or anything like that, you know, I'll be, where I have liberty with my people, and I can just they'll have less resources to do that with, and insofar as they're still doing it, I can kind of put it out of mind. Is that basically accurate?
Well, let's not, because the show is to introduce your ideas, and let's, I don't want to. I already said enough of kind of my ideas, and I've had several weeks to do so. So I don't want to usurp your time, Jake, because I want you to explain.
Don't worry about that.
But I got my. I made my point,
if I understood you right, and I just want to clarify that, that I did understand that right. Then I mostly agree with that, but my problem is, I've become very alert, I think, to just the nature of power and how power works in a way that, unfortunately, socialists have been talking about for a long time. And, I don't like their answers regarding it. But I think they've maybe caught on to some of the problem, which is, well, we have this giant source of power in society, the state. And, there's all these wealthy interests, like wealthy business people that, they can just spend their money to kind of like buy the state essentially. And then it will do whatever they want and what's in their interests within, I don't know, I guess some kind of limits. I don't even know at some point.
You're describing the left critique of society, basically, of capitalist society, let's say. That they can,
I don't know
wealthy people can buy power.
Yeah, basically. But, I don't agree with it as a critique of capitalism. I agree with it as a critique of power, in the sense that power is centralized and power can be bought. My answer is decentralized power. But the problem is, how do you do that? Now, I don't even think most of the socialists, the anarchist ones do, but most socialists, I don't even think want to really decentralize power. They want to take over the state so that they can, run things their way. And I think where I extend past their criticism is, wealthy capitalists are, one interest group. Others are, unions that, want to buy off the state for the advantage of their members, and to artificially raise prices for their services and make things more expensive for everybody else. And there's all sorts of interest groups that lobby this state. There's foreign governments, that lobby the state, or, maybe not technically foreign governments sometimes if we're talking about like APAC, but Americans who are more loyal to another country than they are to this one. And that's not necessarily only an Israeli American thing or Jewish American thing. I think we're also seeing it a lot right now with Iranian expatriates in the United States who, they're so angry about, the Islamic regime in Iran. And I agree with their criticisms of that regime fully. But because of that, they hate that so much and they want it overthrown that, they lobby the government to get involved in wars that are to their niche interests because of their life experience, but not actually to the interest of the majority of Americans who, it doesn't affect us what government that they have there. And I would like it to change, but I don't want to, do tens of billions of dollars in deficit spending, hundreds of billions by the time this war would be over if it keeps going. And sacrifice American lives and safety and security for their pet political issue, even if I sympathize with it. So there's all these interest groups. Those are just a couple that I'm naming that lobby our government, and if they have the resources to gain power, then they want to use this power. And I just kind of see the incentive structure of that system as very, very problematic. And I don't maybe we can gain small amounts of freedom to withdraw from that, but whenever it won't really be permissionless, because once they, if we ever break away in a way that stops them from or seriously inhibits them in their pursuit of power, then they don't want to and won't let us. And so I don't, my best hope here, and again, I am very, if you can't tell, I'm feeling very pessimistic over the last months, maybe a couple of years. And I didn't used to be this way. I didn't used to be this way at all. I used to be very, very optimistic. I think technology is the best answer that we can have. Crypto may or may not be it, but it's going to be things like that. Maybe things like the network state, but things where we can fundamentally break the incentive structure in some way by the introduction of something new that really radically changes the incentives that we're living under and how those incentives relate to power and the pursuit of power. And I don't know what that thing is going to be. I'm getting more interested in technology myself, thanks to AI really lowering the barrier on programming. I'm learning a lot about, programming, and I'm learning a lot about, networking and, how the internet works and how, online security works and, how things connect to each other and all this kind of stuff. And I don't know what the answers are. I'm not, but I am like very at the beginning of the Dunning-Kruger curve with that stuff. There's a lot more that I don't know, down the pike before I get to expert level, even though I'm very happy with the little bit I've gleaned so far. But what I do know, and what I think I see already, is that technology is how society radically changes, and the biggest threats that we face are going to come from technology, and I think artificial intelligence in particular, but also our biggest hope is going to come from those same areas. So insofar as we can really be watching how all that stuff is progressing, intervening in it whenever possible, decentralizing whenever possible, that is going to be the most important thing we can do to change the incentives that run our society.
So if I could jump in here, I think that one thing that Adam raised is kind of explain some of the dynamics that Jakey, that you were talking about, because, when he's talking about, okay, well, you could either try to influence the way what the state is doing and whether the state does things like regime or like kidnapping the president of Venezuela and assassinating the Ayatollah of Iran and going to war with Iran and things like that they've recently been doing. And so just war in general and imperialism in general is that they can afford to, precisely because of the tax cattle that it has in us, just the resources that it's able to glean from us. And so the reason why it's able to do that is that it can afford to, because it's taxing us. And so like we could try to persuade it to act differently, or we could just withdraw our support of it by no longer being tax cattle in some way.
But
And
can we? Like, look at the Civil War. The Civil War was fought over the right to secede. And, I, of course, have to clarify for people that don't understand, my framework. Obviously, ending slavery was good, the most important thing ever, probably, actually. And the South wasn't fighting for states' rights per se. They were fighting for states' rights to practice slavery. But the North wasn't fighting to free the slaves. The North was fighting for control and to prevent the very concept of secession. It was not a war goal at the beginning to free the slaves. That came later on. And when that battle was lost, obviously we had the great good of the end of slavery, but we had the great bad of the shutdown of the ability to exit. So yeah. So let's say, we were able to get back, little bits of power because it wasn't ever threatening. Well, what about once it gets to the scale that it is really threatening, that it is threatening to their ability to, our withdrawal of our taxes is threatening to the ability of the state and the power interests' ability to do the things that they want to do. Well, then they're just not going to let us anymore. And they have all the power. And so again, that's just why I say, like, I think technology is maybe like the only answer to that, is like some way where they can't, or it's no longer in their interest to try to go about things that way. But I don't know how that would manifest.
well, that could be a way of secession, like through secession through technology, maybe.
Yeah, I think so. Like, the crypto idea is we don't have to use state money anymore. We're going to get rid of it by replacing it with something better. But the regulatory environment, the tax environment, the fact that every time you sell it, you have to pay capital gains, and that it's not treated as a currency, that it's, complicated to buy and sell, that it's complicated for businesses to accept, because of the tax regulatory environment. I think the Trump administration has been very friendly to crypto in the sense of, well, we want this to be a burgeoning industry, but it's not friendly to crypto in the sense that they care perhaps more than anything about the dollar remaining the world reserve currency and being what everybody transacts in. And so they're not willing to make any of the kind of changes that would, legalize competing currencies in the way that, Hayek or Ron Paul talked about. But yes, I think that insofar as there's certain technological innovations that can kind of get around that can actually get adoption, that for whatever reason, because again, using crypto just as the example, because it's the closest thing to, I think, what we're trying to get at. There's cryptocurrencies that are totally private and untrackable. One of them is called Monero. People could just interact with in this, and the state would not have any ability to watch what they're doing and interfere. But what the state still can do is deal with businesses. And, if they see businesses transacting in it, they can ban that. If they ever try to sell it for cash, they still watch that and tax it. So it can't even quite get grow big enough to really be something where it's like, well, people are transacting in this totally around the state. And our financial privacy laws are terrible. To even buy cryptocurrency for the most part, or to interact with any kind of banking financial institution, you have to engage in something called Know Your Customer, which means, I signed up the other day, thinking about these ideas more and trying to be like, because I actually don't own a lot of crypto. I've only made bad investment decisions in it. So, I'm not an expert on the investing side of it. I just think a lot about the technology, innovation, and libertarian potential side of it. I thought, I should really be trying to at least use this more, interacting in it where I can. So I signed up for a credit card where I'm going to start paying for things. It converts it into cash at the point of sale. To even just get this credit card so that I can transact with normal businesses, using my cryptocurrency, I had to send them a photo of my ID. I had to send them a picture of my face, from my phone. I had to send them, I think, my social security number, like all this sort of stuff, right? So they already have this stuff in place to kind of keep us locked down and prevent these kind of things from becoming a threat, or people to have true, financial independence or privacy to transact how they want to transact. So this is a speed race, or we have to invent these technologies and get adoption for them faster than they can regulate against them. And so I don't know what those technologies are going to be. I don't know if they're possible.
Well,
but hopefully they are, and
quick.
hopefully we can secede from the state through technological tools like these.
One area where I'm sure I dissent a little bit, Jake, on the narrative that you have with regard to cryptocurrency, is that there is a strain of thought which believes that the essential aspect of cryptocurrency was for me to be able to buy Snickers bars and T-shirts in a certain relationship with the government, so that the government either wouldn't know that I was buying them, or that I would somehow, the goal would be to replace the dollar, in a sense, destroy the dollar. There's a whole line of thought around that, but that's not the only line of thinking about cryptocurrency, and specifically for me, Bitcoin. Bitcoin is an asset that the person who holds it self-custodies that asset. It serves right off the top. Three things happen that don't happen if you're not in it. First of all, it's confiscation-resistant. So the only way to confiscate it, you have to go to the person and basically torture them. So that's still illegal in the United States. It's censorship-resistant. So unless you actually have the person in physical custody, you can't prevent them from sending it to another person. And then third, it's inflation resistant. As you know, if I were to have $1 million under my mattress, and even if somebody didn't confiscate it or stop me from sending it to somebody else, it's a melting ice cube, because the government will just print more money, and that $1 million will become a 900,000, will become 800,000. Then I'm forced to avoid that. I'm forced to go invest it. And now I'm vulnerable to all the other things, because if it's in stocks and bonds, it can be shut down with just one phone call. So in my estimation, and I have personal experience with this, somebody who self-custodies Bitcoin is in the highest, most secure asset that an individual can hold, because it's not in your basement. They can't get no German Shepherd can go dig it out. It's transportable around the world. The only way to defeat it is to arrest the people who are engaged in it. And as long as we don't have a total communist society, there's going to be people who are going to be holding that kind of cryptocurrency, whether it's Bitcoin or another similar one. So I dissent from the idea that because the government, because we can't change the dollar to a cryptocurrency of our choosing, or restricted from doing that crypto was a nice try but a failed experiment. It's still something that's providing a very important freedom barrier for those who are involved in it.
I'm not saying it's a failed experiment. I wouldn't be, buying it now and trying to get back into it if I thought it was totally failed and like worthless. So I definitely don't think that. I think it's the best thing that we have available to us right now. But I think my pushback on what you're saying would be, well, why not gold? And my other pushback would be, well, why not cash? Cash doesn't have the inflation side of things, but it has all the other things. Can't know how much of it that I have in my possession. You can't just like pull it straight out of my bank account. You can't do any of that. And the state destroyed gold as our currency already. And so, yeah, people can buy gold to kind of withdraw from the system. But the problem is, the thing was, I don't totally buy the store of value narrative apart from the ability to transact in it at least some level. Because, when gold was the currency, we were transacting in gold. Our dollars were backed by gold. And so they represented trading of gold. And you can still buy gold as a store of value. It is resistant against inflation. And you can even trade in it. You can melt it down to the amount that you want to sell, and you can trade it back and forth with people as coins, or whatever you want. So it's not as transactable as Bitcoin, which can, digitally be sent around the world and, turned into, micro units and all this kind of stuff, and that's a lot more technologically capable. But both of these things, they're not as effective as I think the promise of them originally was against the state. If I do think that ability to transact in them is really, really important, and that the foundation of anything we're going to use as a currency. Because I don't own gold, because even though that would be nice, but the truth is, if I'm going to have my money in an asset, it should be in stocks or some kind of fund, because I will just get better returns that way. And the thing that I'm holding on to gold for, it's not as good a hedge against inflation as actually beating inflation by a substantial amount. And it's not, I can't actually get around the state in any meaningful way with it more than I can with cash. I can just hold cash at home, just like I can hold gold at home. And they could hyperinflate away the cash, but they're not going to hyperinflate away my stocks. So what makes gold, or Bitcoin, particularly unique for me in that way as a holding, apart from the easier ability to transact in it? And if nobody will accept it, I can technically melt down the gold and trade it as coins, but I can't, and I can do that with Bitcoin. But if stores don't actually accept it, it's quite limited. So anyway, that's kind of a ramble, but I guess it's better than, both of these things are better than nothing. I agree, but they're not it's hard for me to see them as seriously, like, the only serious inhibition against the state that they offer more than cash is just the inflation hedge, and there's other assets that offer that better.
Well, that's definitely false. Again, it's if you have a life savings, let's just say you saved up $2 million over the next 15 years of your life, and you're in a better position if even if the laws say, well, you have to hand it all over, you're in a way better position if you have to finally concur. You have the choice whether to go to jail or whether to hand it over. But if it's in the system, it's just a phone call. So the stock market and bonds, all those things can be shut down on Friday night, which is when it will happen usually. Usually it's a Friday night. And there's going to be a national emergency. We're going to have either a nuclear bomb set off somewhere or a pandemic. See the Canadian truckers. And stocks and bonds and anything that's part of the welfare state system it's just a fact. I'm not trying to scaremonger. It's just the Cyprus banks 20 years ago, it's just called a bail-in. And when there's a national emergency, those things will be shut down because everybody will be trying to sell. Everybody will be running for the exits, and then it'll crash the economy. So it will be a circuit breaker. There's all these nice benign names for them, but they all mean the same thing, is that, and already even today, if you're in private credit, there's a little clause in the fine print of your contract when you invested in private credit with Morgan Stanley and Goldman Sachs and BlackRock, that if the market goes down 5 or 10%, they can block your withdrawal. So people can't withdraw their funds right now. And if those were going down and down and down, you'd want to be withdrawing them before they went down any further, and you won't be allowed to. So I do agree that the government can pass a law and say, well, we're no longer going to allow you to change your Bitcoin into US dollars. That's definitely a risk. But the actual asset itself is definitely confiscation resistant to confiscate it or to stop me from sending it. I forgot it's confiscation. The other one's censorship. To censor it, you actually have to physically have the person in custody. That's the only way. Because right now, if you have a computer, you can cold storage Bitcoin, and the only person would have the key would be in your mind, because you can memorize a seed phrase. And then for sending it, you just need a laptop to send it. So
well, but therein is the problem. Like, I'll grant that in this apocalyptic scenario that you're describing, where not just American markets but world markets are all going crazy like this, and so an asset that you own, not just in the United States but in any country around the world, any bond for any countries or companies anywhere, in that case, gold would have a very unique value because you can have it physically on your person and you can trade it directly with people. But the thing with Bitcoin and cryptocurrencies are that they still ultimately need the internet to validate the blockchain. And we've seen in Iran right now, they can just shut off the internet to huge parts of society. And so maybe there's a technology answer to this already that I don't know. And if there's not, there should be. Like this is the kind of, technology can help us break around the state answer that I'm looking for. But right now, my understanding is you're still going to have internet to validate blockchain transactions. And so if the internet goes down, which they can very easily do, and we've already seen states do that, then
it would have to be worldwide.
Crypto doesn't work.
The miners are in all countries, so you could shut down the internet in Tehran, for example, but you couldn't. In other words, shut down the internet worldwide, which I suppose is technically possible. But then we have huge problems. Then you can't produce food, or then you can't move water through pipes. So you're right that you could shut down the entire internet, but to my understanding, maybe I'm wrong about this, you don't have to shut off the internet worldwide. You just have to shut off the internet locally. Like if we're in the same room and I decide, I want to give you Bitcoin in a way that you can trust that you've received the Bitcoin. Well, okay, maybe in some other country the miners are operating, but how do we get our transactions over to the miners to be processed? Oh, well, my understanding of Bitcoin is it's decentralized, so that you don't have to have, if you can ask somebody who's smarter than me, but if there's 10,000 nodes and you shut down Iran, okay, so now we have 9,987 nodes. So the Bitcoin protocol keeps validating, even if 13 people are wiped off the earth, even if it was 10 countries.
Yeah, but that's not what I'm saying. It's more like this. Like, let's say we have Google.com, okay? And Google has servers in 100 countries across the world, right? So if one country takes down Google.com, Google.com is still operating in all the other countries. But if you're in the country that took the internet down, you still can't connect to Google.com, even though it's operating in all those other places. So yeah, it's decentralized and it can keep operating without you. But at that time, you're the person that most needs the ability to transact.
Of course, you could achieve the same thing, Jake, and just say, well, what if somebody came in your apartment and took your computers? Then of course but one is a lot easier.
If a country shuts down the internet,
then I'll grant you that then you can't do anything that requires the internet. But the
But
country
don't
has
you
to
think in
the
this
country has to put the
apocalyptic
internet up
scenario?
or perish.
Yeah, but don't
So
you think in this apocalyptic scenario that you're describing, like that would like where they're just freezing everybody's assets because they need the money right now, that would be one of the first things that they would do. That's what I think.
first thing they would do is on a Friday night, um, uh, shut the system down. So
Yeah,
not the
but
internet. I mean, you could be right, but I mean, the internet, the internet's it's the backbone of the whole world economy. If you shut it, you could shut it down. But even China has the internet. So I mean, the most repressive regimes have the internet. So I mean, this is obviously a judgment issue, and so we can all just maintain our own judgments on it. But Bitcoin's is definitely outside of the system. I mean, you could shut down a country's internet for a week or two, or you could come into my apartment and take my computer and say, "Ha, you can't transact now," and those are both true. But the strength of it is the fact that it runs on what the world needs to run. So as long as the world's running, it's going to be running because the world basically presupposes that the internet's functioning.
There's a lot of hypotheticals here, and so we don't have to get into all of them. But I think there's like China has a great firewall, right? So they can shut down. Like you could, if America was at the level of we're shutting down people's withdrawals and all this kind of stuff, with the level of cooperation that the government has with our internet service providers currently, they don't even necessarily have to shut down the whole internet. They could just shut down in the same way that they shut down access to bank accounts or investment accounts. They could just shut down our connectability to crypto servers and the miners. But this is all very speculative, and it could go either way. And this is already like an apocalyptic scenario where we're proposing different ways that they might act, that are dependent on how desperate they are. Maybe they're not that desperate. Maybe they're only desperate enough to the point where it's worth it to shut down certain accounts so they can hold on to that money, but not like riots are going to break out and so we need to shut down all of society, which is I think I'm speculating, again very possibly wrong, that if they were to shut down like that sort of stuff, it would lead to a kind of like martial law situation where they're shutting down other stuff too. But that well may be a wrong assumption, and it would depend a lot on the specifics and how it manifests.
Yeah, I'm open to other suggestions about what could happen, but my understanding is that if you're faced a national emergency and people started to sell their assets, that would have to be addressed in a meeting after hours, so to speak, and decisions would have to be made how to limit that. And the only way to limit that is you have to stop people from selling. And the only way to do that is you have to shut down the exchanges, and you have to limit people from withdrawing and their funds. So it's nothing. Since I've seen it, and since it's happening even today, because private, as you know, the big buzzword and the financial thing is private credit is exploding, and BlackRock and J.P. Morgan and a few others. I forget. May not be saying the right companies, but they're limiting your withdrawals, so you can't take your money out. So it's happening right now.
So I'd like to return to the foreign policy questions that we were discussing, because the reason I was interested in the fact that it's the tax revenue that finances empire and war is related to the dynamics, Jake, that you were discussing at the beginning of how you have America, which has this really oppressive empire, and that is really projecting power in a lot of terrible ways across the globe. And then at the same time, you have dictatorial countries like China who are much less imperialistic in that way, which is poses a a hang up for a lot of libertarians, I think, because even though you might think that a libertarian would be sort of predisposed against war, which is like the most big government rights violating thing that you can think of, oftentimes they're not, because of that kind of dynamic where you have really oppressive countries like China and Iran and Cuba and Venezuela and North Korea. And so they think that, okay, well, if we believe in freedom and these are really anti-freedom places, then we should oppose these regimes. And the way you oppose regimes from a freedom, a place that has more freedom, is to use the military of your government. And so then you end up having quote unquote libertarians really promoting an interventionist foreign policy and regime change in the name of freedom. But I think what gets them hung up on this, and then because then they can't think that, oh well, we have to be the good guys in these conflicts because we're the pro-freedom country. And so of course that given any kind of conflict that we we're doing it for good reasons and not for ugly reasons. But I think that there's a dynamic that they miss, which is that governments that have a lot of tax revenue, that have a lot of wealth, that they tend to be the ones who can afford to project power abroad. And so they tend to be the ones that do project power abroad, and they tend to be the ones that are imperialistic and are belligerent internationally. But the thing is that the governments who have the largest tax revenue are actually also the governments who are less tyrannical domestically. And that's basically because of the Laffer curve. Art Laffer is known for pointing out, and this is something that Ludwig von Mises points out too, long before Art Laffer did, is that if you tax your citizenry too much, it becomes counterproductive. Because if you tax them beyond a certain rate, then it disincentivizes production so much that you're getting a bigger slice of a much smaller pie. And but then the flip side is true too, that if you really limit the extent to which you tax your citizenry, then then you have like proportionally, maybe, well, it's not proportionally, but you're taxing them a lot less than you could. But because the pie is so much bigger, the slice that you have is really huge. And so it's actually governments that are less tyrannical domestically that tend to be more tyrannical internationally because they can afford to. And then the flip side tends to be true too, is that like governments that, like North Korea, that are just like these communist basket cases, North Korea is not going around like pushing people around internationally, largely because it can't afford to, like because it is a communist basket case. And I think that this Well, and first of all, like, Jake, what do you think? What do you think of that explanation for these differences we see?
Well, first of all, I think that's a very interesting insight that I had not occurred to me about, the Laffer curve and the connection of, domestic oppression to foreign imperialism, it being inverse. It strikes me as correct broadly. I think that there are clear, like it's a trend, not a rule. Because we can look at Switzerland, Sweden, places like this, and find the opposite of that rule. We can look at African nations, many of which are very poor and are like constantly invading their neighbors and fighting with each other. So there are definitely inverse examples on both sides. But what you say strikes me as an important influence, not a sole influence, but an important influence on the ability of states to engage in foreign entanglements. And so I think as a correlative trend, I would I I think it's probably true. I'd be interested to see it like studied, like empirically.
Yeah, because then you also get, you know, the American Empire is sort of the heir of the British Empire, and Great Britain was the quote unquote land of the free, but it was also like the empire upon which the sun never sets, for a long time, and but I think that there's an interesting dynamic there. So I wrote this article for the Mises Institute many years ago called "The Cycle of the State," where I posited that, like, because of this dynamic, that that the state is somewhat cyclical, because what you have is that, okay, so you have domestic freedom, but then and domestic, like, free, including the freedom to produce and to keep the fruits of your labor, largely. But then because of the great productivity that yields, that tends to finance empires and wars, empire and wars. But then another dynamic is that, like Randolph Bourne said, war is the health of the state, and um, that, like, Robert Higgs demonstrated, is that crisis is the health of Leviathan. That wars and crises in general enable governments to be able to swell in the name of the emergency. It's like, oh, you've got to give us all this power and all these resources, because don't you know there's a war on? Don't you know that there's this emergency? And so then that's where the cycle kind of makes a turn, because um, you've got domestic liberty breeding war, but then war, like, then strangles domestic liberty,
Mm-hmm.
which then, because it kills the goose that laid the golden egg, that's why empires collapse, is because of, like, the tyranny, and also just the expenditures, um, just collapsing the tax base, or shrinking the tax base. And so then at some point the empire overextends itself so much, and is you know drains the tax base so much that it can no longer afford foreign wars, and it becomes poor and less imperialistic, um, and yeah, and so then it's kind of cyclical in that way, and so it just makes me think that that's one of the reasons why I'm skeptical of trying to rest our hopes on a less tyrannical, more freedom loving government. because it just seems like it's just going to create a cycle that like the more we're successful at that, the more we're going to tend to have empire and war, and then that's going to eventually squander all of our gains anyway. So I wonder if like the struggle for liberty is even compatible with a state at all.
Well, first of all, I think I agree with everything that you're saying. That cycle makes a lot of sense and is visible in a lot of different examples. I think the struggle for liberty is necessarily happening in whatever world we live in. So, the struggle for liberty, given that it, in the libertarian conception, is about achieving our negative rights, is necessarily a struggle against something. So I don't, but your sense of hopelessness there of that cycle is, I think, very much the same hopelessness that I'm feeling and that I tried to lay out like earlier in this show. It seems basically identical to me, where it's like you've identified the incentive structure there, and that incentive structure is like a major problem for our ability to break out of it. It's also, you mentioned at the beginning of that, seeing libertarians or so-called libertarians argue for intervention in various places, arguing for a more aggressive military, because they see the fight for liberty as global, and we have the ability and we can help those places. And well, first of all, I agree that the fight for liberty is global, and that my sympathies and my desire to help are with people all around the world. I am not like an American hypernationalist or anything like this. So I think that's all very important and good, and I want liberty for Iran. I want liberty for Ukraine. I want liberty for Venezuela. I want liberty for all of these places, and I will cheer when they achieve it. However, I think for many of the reasons that you laid out, asking the state to get involved in this sort of thing is the undoing of liberty here at home. And there's multiple reasons for that. One is the cycle that you set up. The other is just the inherent nature of the ask, of using the state at all for military goals, or really any goals, but especially military goals. Like, you are saying that in order to free people someplace else, you're okay risking people's life or actively sending them to die without their consent, because that's what you want. Not you, of course, but people advocating this. And that is the opposite of liberty. That is the opposite of individual rights. And this is also true on the financing side of it. You're asking people to send their money. And not just that, but when we have the deficit and debt that we have right now, you're asking people to send their money to free people over there without their consent. That is the opposite of liberty. That's the opposite of libertarianism. And so I think a lot of this stuff has come up because of Millet in particular, who I spoke very positively of earlier. But this is one area in which I think he is just terrible and really deeply anti-libertarian, and people are complicated, right? Ayn Rand was really bad on this stuff. The objectivist position was always, fight these wars for liberty. And, there's nobody that's made more libertarians, I think, than Ayn Rand. But at the same time, she was terrible on this. And she wasn't a libertarian. And this is one of the reasons that she disagreed with libertarians, even though the philosophy is so close that she created so many. But you look at places in South America where their fight for liberty so often looks so bleak. And I feel for that. But because of that, they want to do this thing that I mentioned about Iranian expats earlier. They want to bring somebody else, sacrifice all their rights and their liberty for their own political interests as an interest group. And that's what this game is that's going on. Sacrifice American liberty for the interests of the Venezuelan interest group, or the Iranian expat interest group, or the Ukrainian expat interest group, or Ukraine itself, insofar as they're lobbying the United States, right? So this is very disappointing to me, because this is the death of libertarianism domestically, this sort of advocacy. I think because Malay has been so popular, this has been able to this viewpoint has been able to gain a lot more of a foothold in the American libertarian movement, even though it is antithetical to the history of our movement, with the exception of Ayn Rand, who is also somewhat outside of it. So what I would say to these people who have very frustrated me is, if you hold this pro-war view, your views are fundamentally incompatible with libertarianism, and you should not call yourself a libertarian, and you should leave the movement. Unfortunately, they are not going to do that, and have no desire to do that, because of the same power and interest dynamics that I laid out at the beginning of this episode, where, no, they don't want to do that. They want power for their way of seeing things, and, for libertarian institutions to do what they want them to do. And so they're not going to do that. And that is very disappointing to me. So I think the rest of us, we really have to defeat this viewpoint. Insofar as people have left the libertarian movement over disagreeing about war, I think it has made the libertarian movement feel smaller, which is made me very sad. I think in a lot of ways, we as a movement have been losing the debate over foreign policy over the last, certainly the start of the second Trump administration, maybe a little bit longer than that. And so I feel one of the reasons hope feels so bleak for me is that, as I said, if you don't agree with libertarianism, you should leave the movement. At the same time, I want people to agree with libertarianism. So it makes me sad, both on the one hand that they don't, and then, so better they leave, but also bad that they're leaving because they disagree, because then we're just smaller people that, actually hold the philosophy. And it is my hope that the social dynamics of our society lead, in particular, the failure of this war that is about to come, lead to a resurgence of true anti-war libertarianism. But in the meantime, we have to be vigilant. We have to be the remnant within the movement, not just within society, but within the movement, that is stressing, that this is the philosophy. This is what we believe. We believe this because we can demonstrate that we are correct. And, our time will come, I hope, when the incentives and the social dynamic of the broader political conversation um, align with people wanting to hear our voice, just as they were with Ron Paul in 2008 and 2012 in reaction to the Iraq War, and just how over economic issues they were with Malay and Argentina more recently.
Yeah, I think another argument against this notion of promoting liberty through military intervention is that war is the health of the state, not only for the imperial state, but also for the state in the regime change target. And so even if it's just Cold War, like Cold War is the health of the state. I think that because of the rally around the flag effect, that these regimes that we're trying to get changed at first through Cold War tactics, like with our really long running Cold War against Cuba, the Cold War against North Korea. I just think that it's actually strengthened the regimes in those countries because of the rally around the flag effect. That when there's this, you know, huge empire that is just, you know, menacing these countries, then the people feel attacked by that empire and they want to give more support to the government as a bulwark against that empire. And then the government in turn is able to, you know, really easily make a case for being that bulwark, because then it has this a boogeyman and a scapegoat in the empire, and be able to point out and be able to make the case that that you need me. You, like, whatever disagreements that you have with my regime, we're at war. This is no time for dissent. This is no time for division. That we need to unite under the flag in order to, you know, survive against this this imperial power. And that's why you have like the Kims in North Korea and the Castros in Cuba having this otherwise baffling longevity, that they're so tyrannical and they're so evil and they're so oppressive, and yet they just last generation after generation in the face of this this Cold War by like the greatest military power that's ever lived. And I don't think that's a coincidence. And I think that there's like a counter example to that are countries where the United States has thawed its Cold War against them. Because, you know, a counter example to North Korea is Vietnam. That, you know, we stopped the Vietnam War, and we normalized relations with Vietnam, and Vietnam actually liberalized since then. They didn't become like this like insane Stalinist regime like the Kims. They're just kind of like a normal country now. And I think that's because we stopped going to hot war with them, and we stopped the Cold War against them too. And so then, you know, then the government just had to worry about popular legitimacy and not being too tyrannical, you know, because they didn't have this huge scapegoat and boogeyman to point to. And so people like felt that they could, you know, afford to not rally around the flag and to criticize the flag. You know, same thing that when Nixon went to China, that's when Chinese reforms started happening, like market reforms, and that's when China really started becoming an economic powerhouse subsequently. So yeah, so even if the regime actually does get overthrown, that's not necessarily a win for liberty either, because, like, for example, you see that, like, yes, you know, Saddam Hussein was bad, yes, Bashar al-Assad was bad, yes, Muammar Gaddafi was bad, and then these tyrants were overthrown, but then what replaced it? Just chaos, carnage, just a failed states, civil war, and whatever potentates like cropped up afterwards were like more savage than the regime that was overthrown. And yeah, and so I think that, again, war is not like the road to freedom. And we're seeing that right now in Iran too. Scott Horton has been making the case that, you know, we're especially bombing Tehran, and Tehran is like a very like urban center, and as an urban center, that's where a lot of the Iranian liberals are, like the most hardcore supporters of the Ayatollah, and the theocratic regime are more in the countryside, and so mostly like the U.S. and Israel are bombing the very kinds of people who, you know, they would want, or at least the U.S. would want to, you know, take over from the Ayatollah. But now, like what you're seeing is like in the streets of Tehran, they aren't like welcoming us as liberators. They're flooding the streets in support of the regime.
And of course,
right.
Because people don't want to die.
Yeah.
First, I agree with you entirely. And it's all the more reason that it's so disappointing that these, you know, pseudo libertarians are advocating for this sort of stuff, because it's like, it just doesn't work. We just have example after example of it not working. Like, was over 20 years in Afghanistan not enough for you? But it seems like there's this hubris that comes with power. You know, when you have something so powerful like the state, you want to use it. It has this psychological effect on people. It's the ring, you know, from Lord of the Rings. And so with this administration, well, okay, they did something in Venezuela. Well, they had some limited kind of success in Venezuela. Well, now it's fully off. You know, let's do this whole war in Iran. Well, you know, much like in Lord of the Rings, you know, using the ring too long corrupts you and eventually leads to your own downfall. So it doesn't it doesn't work. It just doesn't work. And it's just so disappointing to me to see people that should understand this more than anyone, which is other libertarians or former libertarians, get corrupted, you know, by this sense, because it makes me feel like, well, did they ever really understand it? And it really seemed like they did. But I've just seen this experience at so many times in my life. I saw it, you know, something we haven't talked about on this show, but, you know, I've spent a good chunk of my career advocating against identity politics. You know, I wrote a book on this topic, and you know, it just really struck me like, all right, well, there's all these people fighting against identity politics, understanding why identity politics is bad and victimhood culture is bad, you know, not just for society as a whole, but for the groups that are practicing them. You know, even if they're trying to use victimhood as like a means to appeal for power or political gain, like, this isn't good for them. It's psychologically unhealthy. You know, this whole thing, it's bad for everybody all around. Well, okay. And then October 7th happens. And all of a sudden there's, you know, huge swelling of complaints about, you know, domestic anti-Semitism and international anti-Semitism and, you know, victimhood culture for Jews is, you know, and I was raised Jewish, to be clear, is okay now and good. And this is very disappointing. And there were all these people that were fighting against this, and they became some of the loudest advocates for the direct, exact, specific things that they advocated against. Just now it was a different group that they had a different interest relationship with, whether it was being a member of the group themselves, or whether it was working at an organization or for an institution that gets a lot of donors from that group or is run by people of that group. And this conversation triggers a lot of people, so I just have to be like super clear. I don't mean Jews when I say that. I mean Zionists when I say that, of which most Jews, but not all Jews are. And even among Zionists, there's all sorts of different groups that will have different philosophies about different aspects of it, and don't all think alike. Especially don't think alike about how to do political activism. But anyway, I have to do all that throat clearing, which takes me away from the real point, which is, why is this? I saw it there with identity politics. I see it now with different groups, with war. What is going on? And I don't understand this. This is something psychological about humans, but it's something that, if you guys have an answer, if you know what's going on, please tell me, because it's really depleted like my faith in humanity in really deep ways, that people just don't hold their principles or values once it's remotely inconvenient for them to do so. And I didn't ever think that this is what people were like, and now I do, and it makes me sad.
Yeah, so you mentioned your work on identity politics, and that even before you were a libertarian, you were anti-war, and so I assume you were against U.S. wars on behalf of or in alliance with or supporting of the wars of Israel as well. And then also, you were raised Jewish yourself, right?
Yeah.
So could you tell us about sort of like your evolution in terms of like being raised Jewish, and then what you were raised to believe in terms of like Zionism and Israel's policies, and then how that factored into like your like anti-war position even before becoming a libertarian?
Yeah, I wouldn't say my views on Israel were so related to my becoming a libertarian. In fact, it's more the other way around, that my libertarianism developed my views around Israel, although they were already negative before I was a libertarian. My story from the earliest days, really, I think I couldn't have come to libertarianism without first being an atheist, actually, which is very different, from you, Dan, and very different from most libertarians. But I don't think it's actually a unique story. I think that there is a subset of libertarians that came my way, which is, I grew up I was raised not just Jewish, but Orthodox Jewish. And, it was a religious upbringing. I was sent to a religious school. The school was also a Zionist school that very much, put, we were fed all sorts of lies and things. But there was something, I never liked the religion. And there was something that, when I first even realized that, like, oh, they're telling me there's a God, but I don't, they don't know this, right? Oh, they've just been lying to me, or, maybe not lying, but, at least not telling me the whole truth about the nature of their beliefs. When I was very young, like 10 years old, like I remember when I first realized, like, it was this feeling of, oh, they've been lying to me. Once I first heard the word atheism, it was like, I remember it still. It's one of my earliest like memories that I still hold like in great detail, of like time just kind of freezing as like I put together all the pieces in my head, and I was like, I understand what's going on now. And so that created a massive distrust in authority. And that doesn't mean authority is always wrong. And, I'm a very analytical person, and there's, I think, if you can't tell from earlier in this episode, I am more establishment on finance and investing behavior than I think Adam is with regarding crypto, right? So that's, a fun example of like, I can be more establishment than people, like, in a lot of ways. So, I go where it, wherever my logical analysis, and I'm not saying I can't be wrong, but wherever my logical analysis takes me. And, and that has to come from a place of not a what's the word I'm looking for? Like reactive distrust, but a critical mindset towards anything that, comes from people that, would have power over me. And so I just started applying that sort of like critical way of thinking to everything. And, you know, that applied to Israel for sure. So that's why, I didn't necessarily connect religion and Israel so much right at the beginning. They were being taught to us together, but also kind of separate, right? Like we're taking religious classes, but also Israel is the home for, ethnically Jewish people, and it's not a theocracy, right? So they weren't so much connected in my head at the time. As I've thought about it more, they are connected a lot more. But so I didn't, it's not like, oh, I rejected Judaism, therefore I need to reject Israel. But I just started applying the critical mindset, and just everything they were telling me started to fall apart very fast. Like I basically developed the Palestinian position on things without ever reading a Palestinian, by just kind of trying to think to myself like, okay, but what would the other side be? Then I ask this to like my teachers and other authority figures. They can't give me a good answer. And well, there I am, right? But my views on war at the time were very common, to my community, and have not changed. I grew up in the suburbs of Washington, D.C. and Maryland, a very blue state. And, Democrats at the time, there was, many Democrats voted for the Iraq War, but the popular sentiment of Democrats at the time was being anti-war, and so anti the Iraq War at least. And so I was convinced by the arguments that were being made at the time, and I didn't think the Bush administration was making a lot of sense. I remember being driven to school in the early days of the Iraq War by my mom, and I'm sitting in the back of the car, and she's listening to the radio, and they were talking about, Saddam let in weapons inspectors, and they said, they don't see any weapons, but, the administration is saying we have intelligence otherwise. And I'm like, well, I remember saying to my mom, it's like, well, they went in, like, what more do they want? And I'm probably like 12, 12 or 13 or something, right? And if I could figure it out at 12 or 13, and the government couldn't and was lying to us, that's pretty bad, right? So that's just where the truth was at that time. And I haven't really wavered on that. I think it's still true. All the arguments that were being made by Democrats against the Iraq War, not all the arguments, but many of the arguments that were being made at that time have, remained correct, still apply. They're the same arguments libertarians were making. That's why Ron Paul was able to appeal to me so much, because I saw we had something in common. And then I was able, once you trust somebody, you're able to learn a lot of other things from them. And those are still my views on war now.
Well, Jake, it's so great for us to get to know you better, and for our viewers and listeners to get to know you, the mind behind the production of this podcast. Thank you so much. Adam, do you have any last questions for Jake?
No, I think we covered it quite a bit. I do. My argument kind of is that there's different schools of libertarianism. It's my, I strongly believe that there are. And one school of libertarian thought is, a large portion of it is a critique of the welfare state or nation state conduct. So, for myself, I guess the main conduct that the nation state does that I disagree with is it involuntarily enlists my services and my assets. And so that's the one I'm focused on above all others. And I agree with the sentiments that you guys are expressing, that to take my wealth and my labor and then to apply it for a foreign war that I don't support, or that's not for a country that's not threatening me, that is problematic. And I definitely agree with that. But I guess, subject for another, maybe we can have another discussion, but I guess I feel that there's only so far that the critique of the nation state can take us, because we can agree that there's out of 100 things, this is the worst thing they could do, and the 99th worst thing, and then we go down and down and down. But really, what enables it all, and I think you touched on this, Dan, was if they have an unlimited supply of my assets, and I just have to turn it over, then that's really the issue. So as long as that happens, then that organism's going to grow, and the fact that it wasn't that I didn't voluntarily contribute is a guarantee that they're going to use those assets for something that I wouldn't have used them for, because otherwise they would have said, "Well, Adam, here's the assets, go do it, because we know you do the right thing." But the reason it's compulsory for me to turn them over is so that I can't apply it over here where I was, so that they can apply it over here. And of course, now I'm angry because they're applying it over there. Well, don't fund a study on why Adam's a bad guy at Stanford University. Well, they're saying, Adam, well, what did you think we were going to do? We would have left the money with you if we're going to use it for something you agreed with. So I've realized that a long time ago. So I just realized that as long as I'm kind of a loser on that initial transaction, it may be tragic what they do, but it just comes with it's in the contract. If they had wrote you a contract, it would say, just so we're clear on this, when we take your tax dollars, we may spend it on things that you don't agree with. And by and large, it's like 99% of the time that's true. Of course, some things are more unjust than others and more mean-spirited than others, and bombing people and all that. But I've been chased out of the West Coast of the United States, so I'm focused on that. I experience it I take it personally because it's actually hurt me personally. So to me, that's a high priority. And it's not just me, there's other people. It's my family, and it's people that I know. And so I see that as a grave injustice. So I guess for me personally, I don't need to be convinced that the government's doing great injustices overseas, because I know how they're treating me as a person, and it's really bad. So I have sympathy with the recipients of the fruits of my tax dollars in the form of heavy loads of metal and explosives. I do sympathize, because I wouldn't want that to happen to my family or to me or to people I love, or innocent people. But I have my hands full, because we're turning into a communist democracy over here, and it's a serious issue. My daughter's, in her 20s. I have family. I'm concerned. So, and then, anti-war, I'll say one last thing, and not to ruin the whole party, but, when I hear the left say it used to be anti-war, it's like, interesting. Wonder if 100 me and my friends tried to get free of the welfare state. Wonder how that would work with your anti-war stance. And then I wonder how, antiwar.com, give me your analysis of the 1776 revolution. I want to give me your analysis of how you analyze that. Was Washington a warmonger? I mean, I just want to see the analysis. Or is it dependent on context, and you're against wars that you don't support and you're for the ones that you do? I think it's a hard problem, because I'm going to be pro-war if it's something super important to me and somebody's trying to liberate me or something.
Well, let me clarify, because I agree with you. I certainly believe in defensive war. And that's what libertarianism is all about, right? There's a reason the Libertarian Party's symbol is the porcupine. And that's because porcupines don't hurt anybody unless somebody tries to hurt them. And so, there are many pacifists that are libertarians, but libertarianism is not pacifism. And so the American Revolution is a defensive war. And any defensive war where somebody is defending themselves against violations of their rights, that is a completely different thing than fighting to free somebody else over there. But also, I mean, sorry, let me say one thing that goes back to something from earlier in the episode, because I meant to say it and I lost my train of thought, which is another thing that really disappoints me about the libertarians that are pseudo-libertarians that are advocating for wars in Iran and Venezuela and other places, is that they seem to actually believe the propaganda that this is about freeing those people. And it's not. These have always been like political power wars. And that's just the talking point to try to convince the American people to go along. So anyway, with that said, it is a very different thing, even if it were true that, we were fighting for people's liberty over there, than fighting for a truly defensive war for, your own rights. And so I agree with you entirely. And I think the context is very different.
So, what you're saying is, maybe libertarianism, I don't know, I can't speak for everybody, but we're saying it's not necessarily anti-war, but definitely libertarians, maybe in general, or a lot of them, are sympathetic to people who are subject to hostile activities on our behalf.
If you accept,
to put it mildly,
if you accept the non-aggression principle, and there's other episodes of this show that should be watched regarding that, but my libertarianism is the non-aggression principle, and my personal viewpoint is that is libertarianism, is up to that point. And yes, you can get into arguments about what is aggression and all this stuff, but to not, I think we can probably agree that, like, if somebody attacks you in some way, you're not the one who initiated aggression. They're rarely even claiming that you actually initiated aggression against them. Like, you could get into philosophical arguments about, like, well, is something they did or like didn't do, like, not aggression. But in practice, how this mostly happens, like, we're not claiming that, or well, we've said Iran has aggressed against the United States in the past, but in the current context, where nobody's arguing that, like, Iran struck first and that's why we needed to start this war imminently. It's that we don't like their nuclear weapons program. We don't like, we've used the word preemptive, right? Which in self implies that they did not initiate, we initiated. So, and the very concept of a preemptive war is inherently opposed to the non-aggression principle, and thus inherently opposed to libertarianism, in my view.
Our government doesn't claim to be libertarian, so they're not held to the non-aggression principle. So, they could say, you could advance any principle you want, but we're the United States of America, and we have Constitution, and we got voted into power, and I'm trying to get away with as much powerful stuff as I can, so.
Well, there's room to have a conversation. Like, there's a separate conversation of why people should accept the non-aggression principle, like why that's a good principle to hold. But what I'm saying is that on libertarian grounds, for people that self-describe as libertarian, or for anybody who sees the non-aggression principle as valuable in some level, that this sort of action would go against that. And so that's why we as libertarians should oppose that. Yes, the state, like the non-aggression principle is something that I think we ask and expect anybody that engages with us in any way to obey by, because otherwise we don't have liberty if they don't treat us that way. And
but
the state
Jake,
does not.
I assume you'd agree that what enables my government to do the interventions that it does itself was a violation of your non-aggression principle. In other
Yeah,
words, the way it came into the assets that it did. If I could address that initial aggression and have any impact on that, it would obviate the need to deal with the subsequent aggressions that are enabled by the original aggression. In other words, the primary aggression that enabled the secondary aggression, the one that we're talking about now, the wars, was the original one where I was put into the system and basically, in libertarian terms, aggressed upon to forfeit my assets to a centralized entity, a centralized pot, from which all these other things then occur, in my mind, secondarily. So if I hear to me, in other words, to me, the value of the non-aggression principle, if somehow we could find a way to make it work, let's say somebody read Hope and Hop, and I agree, I no longer should contradict myself, and I agree with him that in aggressing on Adam, I'm contradicting myself. So now I will withdraw from doing that. The main place that I want to apply the aggression principle is when it's being used against me, because to me that would solve. Because if that could happen, it's not just going to be me. Obviously, they're not going to say, "Well, Adam's the only one who's free in the United States." If it ever happened, there'd be a group of people. It'd be larger than me. It'd be 1 million people or 2 million people. And now those 2 million people's assets wouldn't be available for bad things. So I guess in a roundabout way, it's superfluous for me that once the original aggression was, which is the essential one, it's definitely essential, because if they didn't have any assets, they couldn't go do what they're doing. Where'd they get the assets? They aggressed on me, contrary to the libertarian ethic. So, I mean, to me, all roads point to Rome. All roads point to the original separation of me from my labor.
Yeah.
Going back to Locke, you want to say my labor or my body, however you want to phrase it. For me, I say I was coerced. But
this is certainly all true also. Like the entire system, top to bottom, is not libertarian and in violation of the non-aggression principle. I guess, the reason I went down that line is because we were talking about a distinction between like defensive force versus offensive force. And so, in principle, regardless of the fact that we currently have a state that, got all of its money through, terrible means, it is possible to fight a defensive war that is aligned with the non-aggression principle, because aggression means the other way of
not
stating
possible for the welfare state to do it, because
yes, I agree. Yeah,
so in a hypothetical world where I'm not separated involuntarily from my assets, a hypothetical world where I choose where my assets go, I could decide to put my assets into a collective effort, collective war effort. Yes. And you're saying if it would be justified if it's just reasons. If it was defensive as decided probably by us, we probably wouldn't let the other side decide that.
I think that there's an objective standard. And I think that objective standard is actually fairly rare that it's called into question. Like, you could raise like philosophical ways of doing so, but I think in practice, what happens with most wars is they'll quibble on like who actually started it based on questions of fact, but not like what is the nature of an aggression or whatnot. Like usually we'll all have just kind of a general consensus around that. And they'll say, no, well, you started it with this bombing. And they'll say, well, we only did that bombing because you did this shooting or something like this. And this is how wars escalate. But we both agree that the bombing and the shooting are aggressions. You know what I mean?
Even in calling it a preemptive war, they're trying to appeal to the basic moral sense that is related to the non-aggression principle, because the contention or implication is that, oh, well, just as in like if someone was about to punch you, that in self-defense you could punch them first, that that like really like Iran was the aggressor because they were about to, you know, attack Israel or attack like other Middle Eastern countries, which of course is not true, um, but they're sort of like appealing to that same moral sense.
Yes.
Yeah, a universal sense of fairness or right and wrong, and violence. Who's the person who's, as you say, aggressive or
Yeah, I mean, even kids, like they appeal to that when they said he started it. It's sort of like a um, an an inherent like understanding of the non-aggression principle to some extent. Um, well, we've justifiably been somewhat pessimistic in our diagnoses of things, but just to end on a positive note, Jake, what is the one thing that is going on in the world right now that gives you the most hope?
I think artificial intelligence. It's really a dual sided. So it is also, I think, the scariest thing, but also the biggest hope. Just in terms of, we talked after you guys finished a different episode, a couple weeks ago, that like you guys disagree with me here, but I think increasingly like the economic side of libertarianism, which is what so fascinated me and brought me to it and is still very important to me, but long run, and I don't know exactly when, but really long run, I think it's actually going to be the least important part, because I think our society is about to get like so incredibly productive and replace large parts of, or maybe even all, like human labor, to the point that that's going to be freeing of people in a lot of ways. And I think potentially the state may do terrible things with that power, but on the other hand, I think that kind of once there's such a hyperabundance of wealth, they may also feel less of a need to fight wars for physical resources and other things. So I think that it could go a lot of different ways, but I think that is one of those technological innovations that could potentially lead to a very, very bright future, or the opposite, but we'll see.
Well, thanks again, Jake. Thank you, Adam.
Thank you, Jake.
And thank you, everybody.
Dan. Thanks for moderating, Dan.
Sure. See you all later.